Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This morning we'll be looking at familiarizing ourselves with the Bible. We'll be starting our series by looking at the Old Testament. We'll be giving just some general information about the Old Testament, hopefully to help each one of us to come to a better understanding of the books of the Bible and what information each book contains. As we progress in this series, we're going to be using a diagram that will show you a listing of the Old Testament books and the New Testament books and some information about each book. You'll be able to download a spreadsheet from my blog. To get that spreadsheet, simply go to settledinheaven.wordpress.com. Look up the series on Familiarize Yourself with the Bible. And in the context of that series, you'll be able to get information on how to download the Excel or the PDF file if you would like to help you with this series. So beginning right now, we're looking at the Old Testament, trying to familiarize ourselves with the Bible. As we begin our look at the different books of the Bible, you can see our chart that contains every book we find in the Bible. If you notice, these books in this chart are listed in the same order that we find them in the Bible. What I would like us to notice is this. There are 66 books in the Bible. Those 66 books are divided into two major parts. If you notice, there's 39 books that make up what we call the Old Testament. There's 27 books that make up the New Testament. Basically, what we have is this. In the Old Testament, we have books that were written before Christ's first coming to the earth, when he was born of a virgin in Bethlehem. If you notice, the Old Testament books begin with Genesis and they end with Malachi. That makes up the Old Testament. If you have a Bible that has a table of contents, almost all the table of contents show a clear division between the Old Testament books and the New Testament books. So once again, the books that are contained in the Old Testament are Genesis through Malachi. The reason why these books are lumped together is because all of these books were written before Christ's first coming to the earth in Bethlehem when he was born of a virgin. If you notice, not only are there 39 books in the Old Testament, but there's 27 books that make up the New Testament. The New Testament books run from Matthew down through Revelation. These 27 books are similar to each other in the fact that they all were written after the first coming of Christ. So when Christ was born of the Virgin Mary in Bethlehem, every one of these books, Matthew through Revelation, they were written following Christ's birth in Bethlehem. Now, before we begin our study of the Old Testament books, I'd like to point out one more thing. Every book in the Old Testament, along with every book of the New Testament, they share a similar subject. Every one of those books, both in the Old and the New Testament, point us to the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, here's how it does that. In the Old Testament, all the books from Genesis to Malachi, in one way, shape, or form, whether it's by symbols or through futuristic prophecies, or whether through historical accounts, there's many different ways it does it, but all the books in the Old Testament point us ahead to the coming Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. All of the books in the New Testament, either through historical accounts, through a repeating of the teachings of Christ, or through other referrals to Old Testament prophecies. There's many different ways the New Testament books do it, but all of the New Testament books point us back to the coming of Christ and to the Lord Jesus Christ himself. His work, what he taught, all of the things he did while he was on the earth. So it's really important to understand that the Bible, all 66 books that we're looking at in this study, all 66 books share a similar subject. They are all about the Lord Jesus Christ, the Messiah. In the Old Testament, excuse me, Christ will be called the Messiah. That's a Hebrew word meaning the anointed one. In the New Testament, Jesus is called the Christ. That's the New Testament or the Greek word for the anointed one. But in both cases, in the Old and in the New Testament, these books point us to Jesus Christ. That's what the theme of the entire Bible is. It's Christ. So I would like us just to get a real rough idea of how the Bible is set up. First, it presents to us the books of the Old Testament. That's Genesis through Malachi. These books point us ahead to the birth of Christ in Bethlehem. Secondly, then, the Bible is made up of the books of the New Testament, Matthew through Revelation. Those books point us back to that same Lord Jesus Christ who came to the earth and ministered to us. In the Old Testament, he is referred to as the Messiah. In the New Testament, he's referred to as the Christ. Okay, now you should see on the screen before you the Old Testament. We're going to just be looking at the Old Testament in today's lesson. The Old Testament, if you notice, is made up of 5 basic divisions. You have the Pentateuch, the history division, the poetry division, the major prophets, and finally the minor prophets. Those are the 5 divisions that make up the Old Testament. Let's take each division very quickly and look at the books and who wrote those books. The first division we find in the Old Testament is a division called the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch contains the first 5 books of the Bible. It contains the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. All of those books have something in common. Their author. Their author was a man named Moses. By the way, before I forget it, if you would like more information about the different authors of these books, you're welcome to go to my blog at settledinheaven.wordpress.com. I have a series posted there calling Becoming Familiar with the Books of the Bible. Part number 2 of that series looks at the background of each of these writers, who they were, what they did for a living, and some other facts about each of these authors. So if you're interested in knowing more about this man named Moses, you're welcome to go to my blog, part number 2 of the series Becoming Familiar with the Bible, and you'll be able to read more about all of these authors. Okay. Moses is the man that wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy. Those 5 books make up the Pentateuch, the first division of the Old Testament. The next division of the Old Testament is the books of history. These are the books that make up that division. The book of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Those are the books that make up the Old Testament division of history books. If you notice, the book of Joshua is written by a man named Joshua. Okay, the books of Judges and Ruth, as well as 1st and 2nd Samuel, were probably written by Samuel. For sure, Judges and Ruth were written by Samuel. There's a slight doubt among some scholars whether Samuel actually wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel. For my part, I believe that he did. There are some people that believe maybe a man named Nathan or a man named Gad did. But for our studies, we're going to go with Samuel. So Samuel was the writer of 1st and 2nd Samuel. The next 2 books are 1st and 2nd Kings. If you notice, they were written by the prophet Jeremiah. If you notice, then under the major prophets, we have some other books written by Jeremiah in the major prophets. Okay, the next set of books is 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Once again, there's some disagreement on who wrote those books. For the most part, most people believe Ezra wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But there are some who believe a man named Nehemiah did, but we'll go with Ezra. Not only did Ezra write 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but he also wrote the book named Ezra. Then if you notice, finally, rounding out the history section of the Old Testament, the books of Nehemiah and Esther. Nehemiah wrote the book of Nehemiah, and a man named Mordecai, most people think, wrote the book of Esther. Okay, that's the books of the history section of the Old Testament. Now let's look at the poetry section of the Old Testament. This is made up of 5 books: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Those are the 5 books that make up the poetry section of the Old Testament. Who wrote the book of Job? Probably Moses. But the book of Job doesn't actually say who wrote it, so there is some question as to who did, but most people believe probably Moses wrote Job. Do you see the book of Psalms? David wrote most of the Psalms. King David, the king of Israel, wrote most of the Psalms. But again, there's some Psalms within the book of Psalm that were written by others. You'll be able to see those in the context of the Psalms where they actually tell you who wrote them. King Solomon, that's King David's son. King Solomon, who ruled over Israel. He wrote most of Proverbs. But again, there are a few of the Proverbs written by other men. Finally, the last 2 books of poetry, Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, both of them were written by King Solomon. Okay, the 4th division in the Old Testament is the major prophets. There are 5 major prophets. The reason why these are called major prophets and the other prophets of the Old Testament are called minor prophets is because of the length of the book that they wrote. The longest prophetical books in the Old Testament are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. So that's why they're lumped together into a group called the major prophets, because for the most part, and again I emphasize for the most part, these are the longest prophetical books. Let me just say, the message that the minor prophets wrote about was just as important as the major prophets. You know, the terms major and minor are not referring to the importance of the prophecies at all. It's simply referring basically to the length of the prophecies, where, as a general rule, Isaiah through Daniel were longer books filled with prophecies. Hosea through Malachi are shorter books filled with prophecies. So that's why they're called minor prophets. Okay, the major prophets. We got Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. 4 of those major prophets were named after their authors. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. All of them carry the name of their author right in the title of the book. The one exception is Lamentations. That was a book written by Jeremiah. Okay, as far as the minor prophets go, you're going to see, I believe there's 12 of those, if I counted them right. Yes, there's 12 minor prophets. Each one of these books of the minor prophets is named after their authors. Let me give you the list. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Those are all the books that make up the minor prophets, and they are all named after their authors. Okay, I hope this gives you a real brief look at the books of the Old Testament. I hope that it helps you just a little bit to understand why the books are in the order they're in. Again, if you would like to download these charts that I have, they have much more information on the charts that you find in my blog. So if you go to settledinheaven.wordpress.com, I have a place where you can download these different charts. And these charts have much more information about each book, like the date they were written, the dates that they cover, the main events found in these books. Okay, you can get those charts on my blog, settledinheaven.wordpress.com, and hopefully it will further explain to you some of the differences and some of the similarities between these books that make up the Old Testament. Thank you for spending time with us this morning. May the Lord bless you.